To determine whether evidence is admissible, the first thing we have to understand is the concept of relevance. Relevance is the first gateway to admissibility. And here's what Federal Rule of Evidence 402 says about relevant and irrelevant evidence. It says that relevant evidence is admissible unless any of the following provides otherwise: the United States Constitution, a federal statute, these rules, meaning other rules in the Federal Rules of Evidence, or other rules prescribed by the Supreme Court. And irrelevant evidence is not admissible. And let's take a look at this last part of the rule first. All right, the last part of the rule says that irrelevant evidence is not admissible. And that's straightforward enough. If a piece of evidence is not relevant, if it's irrelevant, then it's not admissible, period. All right, but now let's look at the first part of the rule. The first part of the rule says that relevant evidence is admissible unless one of these other things makes it not admissible. And later on, we're going to learn about how these other things, especially other rules in the Federal Rules of Evidence, might make a piece of evidence not admissible. But for now, the important thing is just to understand that relevance is just our initial gateway. See, Rule 402 says that irrelevant evidence, right, evidence that's not relevant, is not admissible. So that means that for evidence to be admissible, it definitely must be relevant. But just because a piece of evidence is relevant doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be admissible. And that's because the rule says that relevant evidence is admissible unless one of these other things makes it not admissible. So relevance is just our first test in determining whether a piece of evidence is admissible. All right, so let's sketch this out. Let's sketch out this relevance test here so we have a visual representation of how the rule works. All right, so let's say we've got a piece of evidence and we want to see whether it's admissible. Well, the first thing we have to do is to run it through our initial gateway, our relevance gateway. We want to see whether the evidence is relevant. Now, if the evidence is not relevant, right, then under the rule here, if it's not relevant, well, then it's not admissible. It's inadmissible. And that's the straightforward part of the rule. All right, but on the other hand, if the evidence, when we put it through our relevance gateway here, if the evidence is relevant, well, what does that mean? Well, that means that the evidence is admissible. It is admissible unless, right, the caveat, unless one of these other things provides otherwise. So we'll put in the caveat unless here. All right, so if we have a piece of evidence that's relevant, then we start with the presumption that it is admissible until and unless one of these other things makes it inadmissible. All right, so let's consider some examples. Let's say we have three things that a party in a lawsuit would like to introduce in trial, all right, and as trial evidence. All right, so we have a gun. I'll draw a gun here. That's supposed to be a gun. Okay. Let's say we have some testimony, some eyewitness testimony. All right, and then finally, let's say we have a document of some sort. All right, so we've got three pieces of evidence, and let's say that the gun is not relevant. It's irrelevant. So let's write that down here, irrelevant. And then let's say that the testimony is relevant. And then finally, the document, well, let's say the document is also not relevant. It's irrelevant. All right, so we've got these three pieces of evidence. Now, based on Federal Rule of Evidence 402, what can we determine about whether these three pieces of evidence are going to be admissible? All right, well, let's look at them one at a time. Is the gun admissible as evidence? Well, we said that the gun is not relevant. It's irrelevant. So under Federal Rule of Evidence 402, and if we use this relevance test here, we see that it's inadmissible. All right, so let's write that down here. Not admissible or inadmissible, same thing. Inadmissible. Well, that's easy enough, right? Okay, so let's look at the next one. Let's look at the eyewitness testimony. Is the testimony admissible? Well, we said that the testimony is relevant. So if we put it through our relevance test here, then we see that it is admissible unless one of these things makes it inadmissible. But we haven't yet learned about how any of these things might make a piece of testimony inadmissible. So for now, our presumption is that the testimony is admissible because it made it through our relevance gateway. And we don't know yet about how any of these other things might make it inadmissible. But nevertheless, let's put our little caveat here. It's admissible unless we later on find out that one of these things makes it inadmissible. All right. And then finally, the document. Let's look at the document. And let's say that this document is actually a photocopy. It's a copy of a receipt. Right? So it's a duplicate of an original receipt. And let's say I told you that there's a rule of evidence, and there actually is one, that says that in general, duplicates are okay as evidence. So generally speaking, a duplicate of a document is just as good as the original. So then, is this document, this photocopy of a receipt, is it admissible? Well, the answer is no. It's not admissible. Why? Well, it's not admissible because it's not relevant. It's irrelevant. So for any piece of evidence to be admissible, it has to first be relevant. It doesn't matter what some other rule of evidence says about whether duplicates are okay, or about whether receipts in general are okay, or anything else about what can be acceptable as evidence. For any piece of evidence to be admissible, it must first be relevant. It has to get through this relevance gateway first. Only then do we consider what other rules of evidence might say about whether the evidence is okay or not okay. All right, so let's review. Relevance is the initial gateway that all evidence has to pass through. It must pass through it to be admissible. Evidence is never admissible if it's not relevant. But if a piece of evidence is relevant, then it is admissible unless some other law prohibits admissibility. So if a piece of evidence is relevant, we will presume that it's admissible until we find some other rule that makes it inadmissible.